What time is it? Where you are? Is it late or early? Are you lying still beneath a blanket, eyes half closed, listening for silence between your thoughts? Are the lights low, or is the room already dark? And wherever you are you warm? Because if you are, if there's even a thin layer of comfort draped over your body, then you already have more than most did in the dead heart of a medieval winter. This is not a story of kings, not a tale of war or politics or conquest. This is a memory of the cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and waited. It waited all season. It didn't strike like fire. It didn't crash like a storm. It crept. It lingered. It pressed itself between the folds of wool and the cracks in the door, and it never left quietly. This is winter, as it truly was. Not white and glistening, not crisp and romantic, but long and hungry and brutal. We begin not in a castle or a city, but in a cottage, small, wooden, leaning slightly, tucked beneath a bare-branched forest, somewhere in the countryside. It is morning, or close enough. There's no clock, just a pale sky behind gray clouds. Inside, it is nearly as cold as out. There is a fire, but it's low. A few glowing coals remain from the night before, buried in ash to preserve their heat. A woman stirs them gently, eyes still heavy with sleep. Her breath fogs in the air. Her fingers are stiff. Her back aches. She pulls her shawl tighter, though it's thin. The children are still asleep, curled close together beneath straw and scraps of wool, their noses red, toes tucked under each other. The man of the house, her husband, has gone out already to fetch wood, or to check the animals, or simply to move, because moving is the only way to keep the cold from sinking in too deep. There is no breakfast, not yet, just the hope of it. Maybe if the bread hasn't gone hard, maybe if the milk hasn't frozen, maybe if the fire holds long enough. Outside, the world is silent, the ground is hard, the air is sharp, everything is still. Even the birds have stopped singing. In the medieval world, winter didn't come with lights and carols and feasting. Not for most. It came with warnings. Wood was stacked early, root vegetables dug up and stored in dirt-lined pits, herbs dried and tied into bundles, the last of the grain threshed, the flour ground, the animals slaughtered, because most wouldn't survive the season anyway. The pigs, the geese, sometimes even the dogs. Meat was salted, or smoked, or dried. Everything else was buried, or hidden, or simply hoped for, because by the time the frost set in, it was already too late to prepare. You survived on what you had, or you didn't. In villages, people huddled together, not out of warmth, but fear of hunger, fear of illness, fear of the long dark days when nothing grew and nothing could be done. The fields were empty, the market sparse, the ground too hard to dig, and so they waited. They sat by fires and told stories. They repaired tools, they patched clothes, and they ate less. Pottage was thinner in winter, bread was harder, ale was weaker, everything was stretched. What was once enough for a meal was now meant to last 3. You learned to chew slowly, to drink hot water with scraps, to close your eyes and pretend that spring was close, that meat would return, that the ache in your belly was just a passing thing. But winter didn't pass quickly. The sun rose late, set early, and did little while it lingered. Its light was pale, distant, weak. There was no heat in it, and night brought dangers. In the dark, the wind crept through thatched roofs and the gaps between stones. Rats came closer to the fire. Wolves came closer to the village. Even people, cold and desperate, knocked at doors they wouldn't approach in summer. The cold made everyone quiet. You spoke less. You moved less. You listened more. To the creak of the wood, to the sound of breath, to the fire slowly dying, and sleep was thin. You woke often, not from dreams, but from cold, from the numbness in your feet, from the weight of a body that needed warmth and had nowhere to find it. If you had a bed, it was shared. If you had a blanket, it was patched. If you had a fire, you guarded it like gold. And sometimes you had none of these. The poor, truly poor, slept in barns, in stables, beneath carts, in corners of the church. If they were lucky, children died. Old people disappeared quietly. Dogs curled up and never rose. And the snow kept falling, not in soft flakes, not in blankets, but in sheets and drifts that trapped doors and sealed windows and froze your boots in place. And still, life continued. Water was fetched from wells, sometimes frozen solid. Wood was chopped, though the hands that chopped it bled through their gloves. Food was cooked, though the pot took hours to boil. And sometimes there was joy, the sharpness of cold air in your lungs, the way frost painted the glass, the moment when the bread actually rose, when the stew didn't burn, when the neighbors shared their last onion, because even in the bitterest cold, people clung to one another. They didn't smile often, but when they did, it mattered. They didn't laugh loudly, but when they did, it warmed the room. And when someone brought news of spring, of trade, of meat, it felt like the sun. But those moments were rare. Mostly, there was the wait, and the worry, and the work of simply getting through the day. And so, the weeks passed, slowly, quietly, brutally. The frost didn't melt, the lard ran low, the walls grew damp, and still they endured, because to survive winter was to suffer with purpose, to wrap the ache in your belly with cloth, to cradle the child who cried from hunger, to whisper stories not to entertain but to distract, to believe that the cold would end, that the ground would thaw, that the herbs would grow, that the lambs would be born, that warmth would return. because in the medieval world it always did, but never before. It reminded you again and again that you were small, that you were soft, that the world beneath its beauty was colder than you imagined, and that survival was not guaranteed, only earned. A cloister buried under snow. It is morning again, though you wouldn't know it from the light. The bell has rung for lauds. The brothers rise in silence. Their breath mists in the cold. Their robes are thin. Their shoes stiff with frost. They do not speak. They do not ask. They step into the chapel, one by one. The stone floor is colder than the wind, and they kneel. They kneel for prayer, not warmth. There is no fire here, not in this room. To warm the soul, they say, is enough. And so they shiver, and pray, and wait for the psalms to end. Outside, the snow has drifted past the sill. It covers everything. The garden is gone. The path is gone. Only the tops of gravestones remain. The cold doesn't stop at the monastery walls. It presses against the glass, finds the cracks, slips in between pages of scripture and folds of cloth, and the brothers feel it. They feel it, even when they don't speak of it. Later, they will work. They will chop wood, carry water, feed animals. Their hands will go numb. Their cheeks will crack. Their legs will bleed from the bite of wind. And still, they will say their prayers. They will eat in silence. They will chew hard bread dipped in thin broth, maybe cabbage, maybe onions. They will eat fast and alone in their thoughts. The fire in the refectory will be weak, just enough to keep the pots warm. There is no indulgence here, not in winter, not ever. But this isn't just the story of monks, because every house, every family, every soul in the medieval world faced the same truth. Firewood was never enough. Not for the whole winter, not for everyone. You gathered in autumn. You chopped and stacked. You counted cords. You measured bundles. You kept it dry, covered, hidden, and still it dwindled. Some burned peat, or dried dung, or straw twisted into thick braids. Others burned furniture, or doors, or carts no longer worth saving. Anything to chase the cold from the walls, to bring heat to the broth, to make the air a little softer. But most of the time, the fire was small, a glow, not a blaze, a flicker, not a flame. People sat close to it, wrapped in cloaks and old wool and straw-stuffed slippers, and they waited for morning, for night, for spring. The day passed slowly, the light never strong. The smoke hung low in the rafters. You coughed, you blinked, you stirred the pot, and you listened to the creak of timber, to the wind through the thatch, to the mice nesting in the walls. And then the evening came. The fire was banked. The room grew colder. The bodies huddled closer, and sleep was shallow, the kind of sleep that doesn't heal, the kind that watches, the kind that waits for the cold to break through the blanket, because it always did. even under the best wool, even next to someone warm. The cold found you in your toes, in your fingertips, behind your teeth, in your dreams. It whispered reminders that your fire was low, that your food was thinning, that the days were not yet growing longer, and in some homes, the cold won. Some didn't wake. Old men, sick children, wives in childbed, they simply stopped breathing, and the family wept, quietly, slowly, because there was no strength for more, because tears felt like ice on the skin, and because the world outside didn't stop. There was still snow to clear, wood to carry, water to fetch, animals to feed, because livestock mattered in winter more than ever. They were warmth, they were food, they were life, and so they were fed while families went without. You saved hay, you checked hooves, you mended stalls, you laid your hands on their sides and felt their warmth, and maybe, for a moment, you envied them, their thick coats, their calm breath, their ignorance of the cold. But if one died, it was disaster. A dead cow was no longer milk. A dead pig was no longer meat. A dead horse was no longer movement. So you did everything to keep them alive, because they would carry you to spring. And what of the towns? In cities, the cold stacked itself in alleys and narrow streets. It froze the gutters. It turned market squares into quiet courtyards. Vendors sold little. The fish froze on the table. The bread cracked in the hand. The cheese split. You wrapped coins in cloth so they wouldn't stick to your fingers. You carried broth in covered pots and drank it quickly. You salted your boots and prayed for dry floors. And when the snow turned to slush, to mud, to ice, you slipped, you fell, you bled, and the cold licked at the wound. There was no clean in winter, only less dirty, and every cough felt deeper, every fever more frightening, because no one recovered well in the cold, and the church was no warmer than the street. You prayed with gloves on, you kissed the stone floor, and felt your skin stick. You whispered psalms through chattering teeth, and still you were told spring would come. Eventually, wherever you are, this story continues, not with an ending, not with resolution, but with more cold, more silence, because winter didn't let up. It pressed onward day after day, night after night, and people, in their quiet and desperate way, did the same. The fires still burned, faintly. The stew still simmered, weakly. The snow still fell, but nothing felt alive. Even time, in winter, felt frozen. You lost track of days. Church bells marked them, yes, but one gray morning blurred into another. The sun rose late and sank quickly. The world outside the window never changed. It became hard to believe in spring. The story said it would return, but your hands were still numb, the ground still hard, the grain sack still light, and so you waited, with your doubt and your hunger, even children who usually carried the sound of life through the village, fell quieter in winter. They didn't play. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They sat near the hearth, cross-legged, blowing on their fingers, sharing dry bread, watching smoke twist toward the ceiling. And when they asked, "When will it be warm again?" the answers were slow, gentle, non-committal, because no one really knew. Even the sky was unsure. Some days brought sun, yes, but a pale one, bleached white, weak, giving no heat. Other days came with wind, fierce and wild, tearing through shutters, rattling carts, whistling down chimneys, and still no thaw. Even the birds had gone. Even the dogs curled into themselves. Even the mice, who crept through rafters in summer, had grown quiet, and the cold deepened. It found its way into the body, toes first, then fingers, then the nose, then the lungs. You coughed in the morning, and it hurt. You drank ale, and it didn't warm you. You stood close to the fire, and still your skin stayed cold. Some people soaked their feet in warm water at night. Others wrapped them in hay. Others pressed them against sleeping bodies, hoping for warmth. But warmth was a memory, not a fact, and memory faded. In this season, illness was everywhere, not loud or dramatic, just lingering. A fever that didn't break, a stomach that didn't settle, a wound that wouldn't close. And there was no hospital, no medicine. There was broth, herbs, prayer, silence. You did what you could, and what you couldn't, you endured. The body, it turns out, could take more than you thought. It bent under the weight of cold and kept going. It ached. It cracked. It whispered, but it moved. To the woodshed, to the well, to the garden that wasn't growing. Because to stop was to surrender. And no one surrendered in winter. Not unless they had to. Even funerals went on. Quiet, simple, a body wrapped in cloth. A few words, soft in the frost. The ground too hard to dig, so the hole was shallow. The grave filled with stones and snow, a wooden cross if there was time. You didn't linger long. You said what had to be said. Then you left, because mourning didn't stop the wind, and grief, though real, had to be put aside. There was wood to chop, a child to feed, a roof to mend. Winter didn't wait for sorrow, so the sorrow waited for spring. And still, people found ways to live within it, not joyfully, not easily, but carefully. They built routines, waking, fire tending, soup stirring, wool mending. They counted their stores, slowly, hopefully. They watched the frost for signs of melting, watched the trees for signs of bud, watched the sky for something, anything, different. And in the evenings, when there was nothing left to do, they spoke, not loudly, but in soft voices. They told stories, stories of other winters, of colder ones, of the year the river froze thick enough to walk across, of the time a merchant arrived with oranges, and the whole town came to see, of miracles and near miracles, of the year when the hens laid again in February, of the time the frost killed all the weeds but spared the barley, of the time old Marga, 90 years and blind, made it through on nothing but dried apples and salted cabbage. They told these stories slowly, and they listened carefully, because stories in winter are not just words, they are fuel, a different kind of warmth. They fill the space between hunger and hope. And when the story ends, you don't feel full, but you feel less empty, and that's something. So they talked and waited and stitched another patch into the blanket, because winter was not something you conquered, it was something you lived through. One breath, one bowl, one day at a time. Wherever you are, just know this: you're not alone in the night, because for centuries, across frozen hills and snow-choked valleys, someone else once listened to the wind outside a shuttered window and wondered how much longer the winter would last. That was the rhythm of the cold. It wasn't a season, really. Not then. It was a presence. It was the way the wind sounded in your chimney, the way the air stung your eyes in the morning, the way your boots didn't dry, even when left beside the fire. And by now, the cold had been here for weeks. The days shorter, the nights longer, the food scarcer, the storage bins had grown lighter, the root cellar emptier, the barrel of salted fish half used, the brine thick with a layer of ice. The pottage was stretched thinner, the bread smaller. Meals were no longer eaten at mealtimes. They were eaten when you were brave enough to go out into the cold, to fetch water, to gather kindling, to light the coals. And when the food was finally hot, you didn't wait. You shared, you chewed, you sat in silence and breathed the steam from your bowl. And you didn't ask for seconds, because there were none. In cities, it wasn't much better. You might be closer to the baker or the brewer, yes, but you were also closer to sickness, to sewage, to crowds that coughed and sneezed and shivered their way through the alleys. The snow in the streets turned gray, then brown, then hard. Children slipped, horses stumbled, carts froze in place, and still people walked to work, to prayer, to beg. Some found warmth in inns or churches, but not all. The poor, truly poor, slept in doorways, under carts, beside bakeries, where the heat of the oven sometimes drifted through the wall. In the mornings, not all of them rose. The city didn't pause for them. It didn't weep. It just moved on, because everyone was cold. Everyone was hungry, and there was no room for grief in a winter that hadn't ended yet. Even animals, the ones that survived, suffered. The cows, huddled in barns, their milk slowed. The hens stopped laying. The sheep grew thin. You fed them as long as you could. Then you rationed. Then you hoped, because they were not pets. They were your spring, they were butter, and eggs, and wool, and meat, and you watched them shiver, and you whispered soft words, and you prayed they would last, because when the animals died in winter, they didn't rot, they froze. You found them stiff, still standing, eyes wide open, and then you had to choose, eat them now, or try to save their meat for later, because once it was gone, and the cold was still here. Even the tools of survival, the objects you trusted, turned against you. The axe cracked in the frost, the water bucket split, the door swelled in its frame and wouldn't close. Your cloak stiffened with frost, your shoes froze into shape, and your fingers were always cold. You learned to work without them, to chop, to sew, to carry, numb, slow, silent, because complaining changed nothing, and stopping was worse. The cold also did something to the mind, not all at once, but slowly, gently, without warning. You forgot things. You left tools outside. You boiled water twice. You stared into the fire and lost time. You drifted. You grew quieter. And in that silence, the stories changed. Not the ones spoken aloud, but the ones told in private. The ones you carried in your breath. The ones about the world waking again. About the green shoot in the snow. The lamb standing in the field. The river cracking, slowly, into water again. You believed them. You had to, because belief was all that softened the edges. And every time the sky shifted, just a little, every time the wind blew warm for an hour, every time the icicles began to drip, you wondered, was this the start or just a trick? Because spring came late, and winter held on longer than it should. But still, each day, you rose. You fed the fire. You boiled the water. You stirred the soup. You watched the smoke curl upward. And you whispered to yourself, just a little longer. You don't have to focus. Just listen. Let the words carry you further into stillness. Because we are still in winter. And in the medieval world, winter was not just a season to be survived. It was something to be endured until it let you go. Not when you were ready, but when it decided. Even those who lived closest to the land, the ones who watched the sky like scripture and knew the scent of frost on the air, could not predict the moment the cold would truly end, because winter didn't melt in a single day. It retreated. Reluctantly, it gave back light first, a few minutes more each morning, a few longer shadows at dusk. Then the ice on the eaves began to drip, a thin sound, steady, like a ticking clock in a room where time had been frozen. It was the first sign, but signs could lie. Sometimes a thaw was followed by more snow. Sometimes the warmth woke the ground too early, and the shoots that reached for sun were snapped by frost the next night. And so, even as the world began to move again, people didn't trust it. They kept their fires burning. They stirred soup, with the same old spoon, wore the same patched cloak, listened still for the wind through the chimney, because they had been disappointed before, and disappointment in winter cost more than patience. It cost your strength, your spirit, sometimes your life. So you moved carefully, stepped lightly, and waited. By now, the stores were low, the root cellar nearly empty, the dried meats brittle with age, the cheese softening around the edges, the last onion sprouting green tendrils, the grain flour dusted with the beginnings of mold. You picked through what remained, chose wisely, used everything, even the peel, even the bone, even the water from the pot that once held stew. Nothing was wasted, not after months like these. And still, mouths needed feeding, especially the children. They had grown thin, their knees sharp, their cheeks pale. Their energy came in bursts, brief, bright, and faded fast. You gave them the crusts, the last egg, the thicker end of the broth, because they would carry spring. Not you. You knew that. And so you smiled, not to deceive them, but to protect them from fear, from knowledge, from the realization that sometimes there simply wasn't enough. But children aren't easily fooled. They saw how slowly you moved. They noticed the sound your cough made at night. They heard the grown-ups whisper. Still, they played when they could, scratching circles into frozen mud, building small towers from melted snow, blowing into their cupped hands to see the cloud of breath. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it gave shape to the day, just as the rituals of survival gave shape to the adult's time. You rose, you checked the fire, you made a list in your mind: wood, water, food, warmth, and then you worked, not quickly, not frantically, but with the patience of someone who has endured long nights and longer silences. You patched a hole in the wall with clay. You swept the floor to keep the mice away. You turned the last cabbage so it wouldn't rot on one side. Small things, quiet things, but they mattered because these were the choices that stood between now and the end of winter, and even when spring began to show itself on the branches, in the thawed furrows of the field. You didn't celebrate yet. You tested the earth with your hands. You watched the buds, but didn't speak of them. You waited until you saw the first bee, until the hens laid again, until the first child ran barefoot across the muddy ground without wincing. Only then did you believe, and even then, carefully, because the shadow of winter lingered long after its breath had left the air. It lingered in your ribs, in the woodpile, in the memory of the night you thought the fire would die, and you with it. It lingered in the way your body ached more now, in the way you counted loaves before sleeping, in the way you listened for wind before sleeping. Winter had changed you, and not just this one, all of them, because each winter left something behind, a line on your face, a story you never told, a name that didn't make it to spring, but also strength, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't smile, but the kind that gets up every morning, even in February, and waits quietly until the cold finally lets go. Are you warm? Because if you are, even a little, you're already better off than most who once lived through winters like this. This part of the story begins not in a house or a monastery, but in the forest, not the forest of stories, of bandits and witches and wolves, but the real forest, dark, damp, wind-racked. In winter, the forest was no refuge. It was a necessity, a risk, a task. You went because you had to, for wood, for food, for herbs, maybe, and you went early because the light didn't last long, and you didn't want to be there after dusk. The paths were slick with ice, ruts hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. Your boots sank, your legs ached, your fingers curled into your sleeves. You pulled branches, dragged logs, broke sticks with your knee. And all the while, the cold whispered through the trees, the kind of cold that didn't shout, it just followed you, pressed against your spine, listened to your breath. Sometimes you went alone, sometimes with a brother or a cousin, but always you moved quickly because the forest did have wolves, and sometimes men who were hungrier than wolves. So you worked fast, and you didn't stray from the path, and you kept your axe close. You returned with as much as you could carry, arms full, clothes damp, skin raw, and that pile of wood, that precious stack, it bought you another day of warmth, or maybe just another night. Wood was more than fuel. It was comfort. It was safety. It was control. In a season where you had so little, and still, the stack always shrank faster than you hoped, because the fire needed feeding. Always, even when the pot was empty, even when the people around it were asleep, even when you could barely lift the next log, you fed the fire like it was a child, because without it, there was nothing, no light, no heat, no hope. And yet, the fire could betray you. Too much wood, you wasted it. Too little, the flames vanished. A wrong move, and the chimney caught, or a stray coal burned a hole through your floor, or your blanket. And so fire was not just warmth, it was management. You tended it like a garden, patiently, carefully, constantly. And when it caught just right, when the flames glowed, steady and silent, you sat near it, not close enough to burn, but close enough to feel it, close enough to let your muscles uncoil, to let your eyes soften, to believe, for just a moment, that the cold wasn't real. But then the wind knocked on the shutters, or the dog barked, or the baby coughed, and you remembered it was still winter, and it was still not over. Sometimes, rarely, winter was beautiful, the kind of beauty that didn't care if you noticed. The trees, white with hoar frost, the river frozen into quiet stillness, the roofs silvered with powder, glistening in morning light. You'd step outside and feel it, not warmth, but wonder, and that was something. It didn't make your hands stop shaking or your stomach stop aching, but it made you pause, made you breathe slower, made you whisper, "Look," and someone would look, and they'd smile, and then they'd go back inside, because beauty didn't boil the pot, didn't mend the roof, didn't stop the frost from biting through your boots. But you remembered that moment. You carried it into the dark, held it like a coal under your tongue, because every small beauty mattered in winter, every patch of sun on the floor, every icicle shaped like a bell, every fire that burned clean. It didn't make the season shorter, but it made it just slightly less long, and that was enough. Breathe softly, let your limbs grow heavier, because the story isn't done. Not yet. We're still in winter, and this time we're walking not through the forest, not through the fields, but through the market. A winter market was nothing like the ones you might imagine today. There were no bright tents, no sweet cider or warm pastries, no smiling merchants wrapped in cheerful scarves. There was cold and stone and silence. The stalls were bare-boned. The cloth that usually fluttered in the breeze now hung stiff, damp, with frost. The tables were warped and cracked from the cold, the baskets beneath them mostly empty, and yet people came because they had to, not to shop, but to survive. They brought what they had: a handful of barley, a dried fish, a broken pair of boots, a scrap of wool, and they looked for what they needed: a flint, a turnip, a small knife, a bag of oats. The trade wasn't lively, it was slow, measured, wordless, often because talking took breath, and breath was better saved. The baker's stall was quiet, his bread was hard, the crust so thick you needed a knife to cut it, but it lasted, and so it was precious. He didn't smile, he didn't call out, he just handed you the loaf and held out his hand. The brewer sold ale that had frozen in the barrel. He broke it into chunks and wrapped it in cloth. It would melt again, at home, over the fire. You hoped. The fishmonger sold nothing fresh. Everything was salted, or dried, or frozen stiff, eyes clouded and glassy. But people still bought, because the market was one of the few places where food and heat still changed hands. And if you were lucky, someone shared news of a merchant arriving soon, of a nobleman giving out soup, of a traveler who saw grass under the snow farther south. It was mostly hearsay, but in winter, hearsay is hope, and hope was worth more than coin. You left the market with less than you came with, your hands full, your face numb, your shoulders heavy, but for another night, you had something, something to cook, something to eat, something to share, and in that there was life, small, yes, but still burning. At home, the market goods were laid out carefully, unwrapped, cleaned, counted, the carrot with a crack, the grain that needed sifting, The cheese that had started to sweat, you scraped, you stirred, you made something of it, not a meal, not really, but a beginning. And that was enough, because in winter, beginnings mattered. They reminded you that endings didn't always come first. Not every day ended in loss. Not every night ended in hunger. Not every pot was empty. And so you turned the spoon in your hand. You tasted the broth. You salted it gently. And you ate, slowly, gratefully, together. Because no one ate alone in winter. And if someone did, you knew. They were close to breaking. Because food wasn't just nourishment. It was connection. You passed the ladle. You tore the bread. You chewed quietly beside each other. You didn't speak much, but the silence was warm. The way silence is when it means survival. And the steam that curled from your bowl was enough to make you believe, just for tonight, that you would last a little longer. Wherever you are, stay still. You don't need to move. You don't need to think. Just follow the breath of this story as we stay still in the long winter, because winter didn't just change your days. It changed your body. Your fingers became slower. Your skin cracked around your knuckles. Your feet went numb. Your legs ached. Your teeth loosened from cold and hunger and sickness, and no one had names for those things. You were just weak, or touched by the cold, or fading, but you still worked, because work didn't stop. Not in winter, not for anyone, even when your joints creaked, even when your knees gave out, even when the world spun when you stood up too quickly. You still chopped the wood, still fetched the water, still carried the pot, heavy with a few small stones and the hope of flavor. And you didn't complain, not because you weren't suffering, but because everyone was. And in a village where everyone is suffering, silence is a kind of kindness. So people did not say, I am cold. They said, this is a hard winter. They did not say, I am sick. They said, I'm slower than last year. They did not say, I am starving. They said, there is less food now. Because pain shared too loudly became unbearable, and pain spoken aloud made it real. So they bore it quietly, even when the coughs deepened, even when the legs stopped working, even when the skin turned gray and thin, and you knew, without needing to ask, that this person would not see spring. Even then, no one spoke of it, because you could not afford grief. Not yet. There was still fire to feed, still bread to stretch, still animals to tend. The animals, too, showed their wear. Cows with ribs like rafters, chickens quiet and thin, goats that no longer gave milk, dogs too weak to bark, horses whose hooves split on frozen paths, and you tended them anyway, not out of sentiment, out of necessity, because without them, spring would mean nothing. And still, the snow fell, not constantly, but often enough. It blanketed the mistakes of yesterday, covered the broken cart, buried the blood from the slaughtered pig, erased the footprints of the child who went out and didn't come back, and it muffled everything. The world was made soft and white and silent, which only made the cold feel deeper, because beauty in winter was a kind of cruelty. It reminded you of what you couldn't have: a full belly, a warm room, a soft bed. Instead, you had frost blooming on your windows like flowers. You had icicles hanging like teeth from the eaves. You had stars, too bright, too far, too silent, and you had waiting, always waiting. You waited for signs: a change in the wind, a patch of earth uncovered, the sound of dripping water from the corner of the roof. You waited for mud. Yes, mud, because mud meant thaw. Mud meant life, returning to the soil. It meant planting would begin. It meant lambs might survive. It meant water would flow again. So you watched the snow melt into mud with reverence, not disgust, because in the medieval world, mud was mercy, and as the days lengthened by heartbeats, people dared to move more. They stepped outside more often. They stood longer near the door. They turned their faces toward the sun, even when it barely warmed their skin. And they began, slowly, to hope again, not loudly, not all at once, but in little things. One extra log on the fire, one handful of grain saved instead of eaten, one child who laughed again. They hoped, because that's what winter taught you in the end. Not just how to suffer, but how to endure suffering without losing yourself. Wherever you are, you're still safe, still wrapped in this slow story, still walking through winter. By now, the people in our story have made it deep into the season, past the first snowfall, past the last onion, past the point where most hopes had grown quiet. But there was one more challenge to face, one more burden that made medieval winters not only brutal, but dangerous in a way that lasted far beyond the frost. That burden was loneliness, not solitude, not quiet, but the kind of loneliness that only winter can bring, because winter kept people apart. Paths froze, rivers stopped, wagons were stored, horses grew thin and tired. Travel was dangerous, so you stayed close to your hearth, to your village, to the few people you saw every day, and everyone else faded. The cousin who lived one valley over, the trader who came with spices in the fall, the priest who visited from the abbey, even the neighbor whose laughter used to fill the common yard. They were still out there, but the cold built walls around every home, and when people are separated for long enough, they begin to vanish in each other's minds. Their voices dim, their stories stop, their names begin to feel like relics, even if they're only 2 miles away. That kind of isolation wears on the heart. You begin to feel small, forgotten, tucked away in a world no longer turning. And that feeling is its own kind of cold. So people found ways to reach across it. They sent messages, short, cautious, written with stiff fingers. They carved small gifts and left them in doorways. They stood on hills on clear days, looking toward the next village, just in case they saw smoke from someone else's chimney, because in the dark, even a wisp of smoke was a sign of life, and life needed signs. So they watched. They watched the sky for birds, watched the trees for bud, watched the wind for change, and in that watching, something stirred, not excitement, but readiness, a readiness to rejoin the world, to speak again, to open the shutters, to walk beyond the edge of the woods. And when the thaw began, that's exactly what they did. First, just a few steps, the road to the well, the edge of the field, the neighbor's fence, and then farther, to the village, to the bridge, to the woods that no longer creaked with snow. And each footstep forward became a kind of healing, because isolation may have kept them alive, but connection brought them back to living. And now, at last, they could begin again. Not suddenly, but slowly as the crocuses pushed through the wet earth, as slowly as the lambs found their legs, as slowly as the frost melted from the well bucket's handle. It wasn't spring yet, but it was almost, and that was everything. Still this breath of a story, moving gently toward spring, but not yet, because winter, even at its end, still had work to do. By now, the cold was no longer cruel, but it was stubborn. The ground remained hard in places. The air, though warmer, still stung in the mornings, and the snow lingered in corners, behind walls, in ditches, beneath trees. The light returned, but not the warmth. So people worked carefully. They tested everything before trusting it: the soil, the tools, their own bodies, because winter leaves more than frost behind. It leaves weakness, and that weakness was in every step, in every breath, in every quiet decision made at the edge of exhaustion. Still, life began to stir. The hens laid their first small eggs. The goat bleated with new hunger. The first bundle of herbs, parsley maybe, was cut and dried and pressed into the old jar with a breath of hope. It wasn't abundance, not yet, but it was movement, and that was enough. The snowmelt fed the rivers again. The mills turned. The markets reopened. And suddenly, quietly, life began to resemble itself again. Not the life of summer, not the open, singing barefoot joy of sun-warmed soil, but the slow, grounded beginning of new routines. Shoes were mended, fields tilled, sickles sharpened, seeds carried in small cloth pouches, held tight in cold hands, and the people, they stepped lightly. Their eyes still watched the clouds for signs of betrayal, their voices still lowered when speaking of spring, because they remembered the years when winter turned back around, when snow came again in April, when lambs froze in the fields, when floods washed away the new seed. So they moved with caution, with reverence, because the lesson of winter was not just endurance, it was memory. Memory written in the body. In the slow way a hand reached for wood even when the fire was burning. In the way a mother counted every loaf, even when the cellar was full. In the way the old men sat closer to the hearth long after the ice had melted from the eaves. The memory of winter never left. It became a shadow behind the spring, not to haunt, but to remind, because once you've lived through the brutal season, you never forget what it asks of you. And maybe that's why the spring, when it finally did arrive, felt so sacred, not because it was perfect, but because you had survived long enough to see it. You don't need to open your eyes. You don't need to say a word. Just listen. We're still here, still walking forward from the cold. But it isn't spring yet. Not truly, because the medieval winter never ended in a single moment. There was no day you woke up and felt warmth. Instead, it left in fragments. The snow melted from the roofs, but lingered in the fields. The wind lost its sharpness, but still slipped down your collar. The nights grew shorter, but they were still cold, still long enough for hunger to return. Because even after the thaw, even after the days grew longer and the streams began to flow, the scarcity remained. The food was gone. The stores were empty. The barrels scraped clean. The sacks turned inside out. And the harvest was still months away. This was called the hunger gap, a second winter, quieter, crueler, because this one came without snow, without frost, without warning. You thought the danger had passed, but now, with no food to store and nothing yet growing, there was nothing to rely on. You couldn't forage, not yet. You couldn't fish. The river's still too cold. You couldn't slaughter. There was nothing left to kill. And so, you waited. Again, not in the cold, but in the shadow of it. This waiting was thinner, more bitter, more exhausting, because you were already weak, already worn. The fire was still burning. Yes, the sky still blue, but your stomach was still empty. And so, you rationed, you watered the broth, you split the last loaf into thinner slices. You crushed old beans and boiled them twice. You steeped bark in hot water and called it tea. And still, it wasn't enough. Children cried again, not from the cold, but from the gnawing. Elders fell silent. Men sat with their heads in their hands. Because winter takes strength, but hunger takes everything. There were no feasts to celebrate the thaw, only more silence, more careful measuring, more quiet prayers. And still, the world moved on. The geese returned, flying in wide arcs overhead. The trees budded, though slowly. The soil thawed, thick and brown and heavy beneath your boots. You turned it, you sowed, you planted, and you hoped. But there would be no food today. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not for weeks. And so you did what winter had taught you best. You endured. You found ways to stretch time between meals. to distract your children with songs and games, to scrape one more meal from the bottom of the pot. And when there was nothing left, you asked your neighbor, and they gave you what little they had, because winter had taught them too that survival wasn't strength, it was shared weakness, a fire passed from one hand to another. We're in the last edge of it now, that strange in between, where the air feels warmer, but the hunger deeper, where the sky is blue, but the fields are bare, where your hands are no longer numb, but still empty, because the final stretch of a medieval winter was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. The cold had done what it came to do. Now, it left you with a cost. You could see it in the faces of your neighbors, cheeks hollow, eyes dull, posture stooped, not from age, but wear. Even the children, now restless with the smell of thawed earth and the buzz of insects returning, had lost something, a softness, an ease, a piece of childhood spent rationing bites of bread and watching their parents turn away from the table without eating. This was the season when the losses became clear. Who had survived? Who had not? Which animals were gone? Which tools were broken? Which homes had stayed warm? And which had burned down when the fire got too hungry? You began to count, not coins, not meals, but people, the empty chairs, the beds no longer shared, the name that hadn't been spoken since the last heavy snow. You didn't hold ceremonies. There were no flowers, just quiet nods, and firewood stacked in silence, where someone else used to work. Grief, in early spring, didn't cry. It carried buckets. It scrubbed floors. It tilled the fields. Because morning had to wait. There was too much to do. The tools came out of storage, blades sharpened, hooks checked, ropes uncoiled, sacks mended. The animals were coaxed out of stalls, the chickens released, the sheep guided to patches of green. You moved like someone remembering how to walk again, because spring didn't erase winter. It just asked you to rise from it, slowly, carefully. The days grew longer, but they were filled with labor, and labor hurt. Your joints still remembered the cold. Your skin still bore the cracks. Your back bent too easily, as if still weighted by the thick wool cloaks you no longer needed. But you moved, you planted, you built, and even that, painful, aching work felt like a kind of prayer, because it meant the worst had passed. You weren't safe, not yet, but you were still here, and that meant something, so you marked it in small ways. A pot of herbs on the windowsill, a small loaf, shared without splitting it in half first, a cup of ale, poured not in silence, but with laughter, not loud laughter, not the summer kind, but the kind that hums from the belly, warmed by survival. And when the first flowers bloomed, someone noticed and pointed and said quietly, "It's starting." No one cheered, but the air in the room shifted just a little, because even if winter would come again, even if more loss waited in some far-off month. Right now, there was color, and that color was enough. Don't move. Don't reach for anything. Just listen. You're still with them, those who survived the cold, and the season, at last, is loosening its hold. But it has not been forgotten, not by the ground, still scarred and muddy from months of frost, not by the people, still moving with caution, as if the snow might return at any moment, not by the walls of the home, still marked with soot where the fire once burned day and night, because even as spring rises, the memory of winter remains. You feel it in your muscles, in the way you stir the pot more slowly, in the way you guard your food, even now, in the way your eyes still search the horizon, not for beauty, but for warning. This is what winter does. It doesn't just freeze, it teaches. It teaches you how to hold still, how to use less, how to listen, and it teaches you what matters most. Not comfort, but resilience. Not celebration, but survival. That's what spring means now. It's not a return to ease. It's not abundance. It's simply relief. The kind that comes in the middle of work, in the middle of planting, in the middle of sewing new clothes, fixing the thatch, gathering eggs, the kind that whispers, "You made it, barely, but you did." You won't say it out loud. You'll just feel it in the way you stand up straighter, in the way you let your child have a second helping, in the way you open the door in the morning without bracing for the wind. And the world itself has changed too. The birds are back, not in flocks, but in scattered pairs, nesting. Their songs are short, curious, careful. The rivers run again, fast, cold, muddy. You lean down to rinse your hands and forget, just for a second, what it felt like to break the ice with a hammer. Even your own breath feels different, lighter, no longer misting in front of your face, no longer something you watch to see how cold the day will be. It's just breath, and that, too, is a gift. You notice things now, not grand things, just small details you had no time for before. The first scent of green in the air, the way wool feels softer when it's not stiff with frost, the sound of a child humming, the warmth in your own chest when you hear it. That's how winter ends. Not with a moment, but with thousands of small kindnesses stacked quietly against the memory of the cold. Don't search for the end of the story. Let it come to you, slowly, like spring itself, because even now, after all the frost and stillness, after the weeks of hunger and silence, winter hasn't entirely left. It lingers in the places no one sees, in the shoes by the door, still lined with straw, in the blanket that no one has put away, just in case, in the corner of the cupboard where the last turnip sat for weeks, and, most of all, in the people. Their voices are louder now, but not like before. They speak with purpose. They speak less of fear and more of plans. The fields are being tilled, the seeds measured, sorted, dropped gently into dark soil. The lambs are strong enough now to wander. The cows are giving milk again, and the hens, once too cold to move, now squabble for space in the dirt. But even with the world returning, there's a weariness behind every step, because winter doesn't just tire the body, it ages the soul. It makes the young feel older, and the old feel further from spring than ever. That's why people remember it so sharply, not just for what it took, but for what it revealed. Who helped, who hoarded, who cried when no one else would, who stayed quiet beside you even when they had nothing left to give. Winter peels everything back, what you're made of, what you're afraid of, what you carry into spring. It's not the scars that tell the story, it's how you move with them afterward. The baker still counts loaves with care. The blacksmith still checks the grain in every plank. The midwife still watches the sky before each journey, because no one trusts comfort just yet. It has to be earned back, slowly, cautiously, through one safe night, one quiet morning, one meal shared without saving a crust for later, and the fire, it still burns, not like before, desperate and devouring, but gently, controlled, a glow, not a blaze, the kind of warmth that says, you can rest now, just for tonight, because you've done enough. You endured the months when the light was thin and the sky too close, and now you're still here, not untouched, but unbroken. That's the true end of winter, not when the snow melts, but when you realize you survived it. Are you drifting gently, quietly? Don't move. There's nothing more you need to do. You've come this far through the story. Let the rest unfold slowly around you. No need to reach for it. We're still here, in the last breath of winter, and even though the frost has loosened, and the sun now lingers longer each evening, the memory of the cold still lingers. You see it, not in the snow, which is gone, but in the way the boots by the door are still dusted with ash, in the way your fingers still test the warmth of the cup before trusting it, in the way you pause, even now, before opening the door, because winter has left the room, yes, but it hasn't left your body, not fully. It lives there now, like a story you keep beneath your skin, a kind of private knowledge, not pain, not exactly, but weight, a weight that shapes the way you look at the world. And now, as spring rises in full, as the birds return in great ribbons across the sky, as the first wildflowers scatter color across the hills, you begin to notice something else. You've changed. You move more slowly now, not from weariness, but from awareness. You notice more, not just beauty, but smallness, the sound of a stream, the scent of clean earth, the way your own shadow falls across the soil as you plant. You notice every detail because you know what it means to have gone without. That's the gift winter leaves behind, not in your pantry, but in your soul. You measure time differently now. not by the bells of the church, not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by what's still standing, the house, the trees, the people. You take inventory, not of things, but of those who remain. The child who grew stronger despite the hunger, the old man who still hums when he sharpens his tools, the midwife whose voice, though hoarse, still fills the room with calm. These people are your harvest. Now, not the grain, not the meat, not the barrels or the cellars, them, because in winter you learned the truth. You are never alone, even when it feels like it. There's always someone else, just beyond the hedge, just past the trees, in another cottage, tending another fire, and they too are watching the sky, measuring the days, waiting for the thaw, and that waiting, shared, becomes something sacred. It becomes a kind of quiet communion. That's what winter taught you, more than anything, not just how to endure, but how to do it together. And now, when you walk through the market, past the stalls with radishes and fresh eggs and new bread, you don't see goods, you see gratitude. You see the baker, with flour still in his beard, smiling a little wider than last year. You see the boy from the next village, carrying a basket almost too big for him, and you remember how he wept through most of January. You see life, raw, uneven, still uncertain, but present. You carry the sack of potatoes home like treasure, because it is, not for what it's worth, but for what it means. That the cold has passed, that the soil has opened, that you can breathe again, and you can rest, not in fear of what's next, but in thanks for what is. Still, the memory of the dark months hums softly in the back of your mind, and maybe it always will. You remember the way the wind sounded through the shutter, the way the fire groaned when it was down to its last breath, the way the bread crumbled when it grew too old, the way silence filled a room when there was no more food left to mention. You don't forget those things. You carry them, like stones in your pocket, like threads woven into your sleeves. You carry them not as burdens, but as reminders of strength, of gentleness, of patience, of survival. The fire burns differently now, not for survival, but for warmth. You don't sit beside it with a blanket pulled to your chin. You sit beside it with a quiet smile, the kind that says, "We made it," and the kind that says, "Next time, we'll make it again," because winter will come back. It always does. The snow will fall again. The frost will cover the fields. The wind will whisper down the chimneys and shake the wooden beams, and you will gather, and you will prepare, and you will remember that you've already faced the longest night and lived. So now, when you look at the last patch of melting snow behind the barn, you do not fear it. You simply nod as if to say, "I see you, I remember you, but not today. Today, there is bread in the oven. Today, there is soup on the fire. Today, there is music somewhere in the distance, quiet, clumsy, real, And today, you will sleep, not from exhaustion, but from peace, because this time you survived the winter. Let the stillness stretch out around you like a quiet path you've walked for hours and still, somehow, are walking because the story hasn't stopped. It's only moving more slowly now. And just as the snow never melted in a single breath, neither does the memory of it. Even now, with the fields greening and the trees budding, there are moments when winter returns, not in the air, but in the mind, in the way you wake in the night and pull the blanket a little tighter, even though the wind is gone, in the way you count the loaves, even though the pantry is full, in the way your voice still drops to a whisper when you speak of the coldest days, because no one forgets the months when the world turned gray, when time itself seemed to freeze, when the heart beat slower, when silence had weight, and now, as the village stirs back to life, those memories don't vanish. They become rituals. You leave the blanket on the end of the bed, even in summer. You save the strongest log for the first frost. You teach the children not just how to plant, but how to store, how to salt, how to smoke, how to ration, not to frighten them, but to protect them, because winter doesn't just shape the body, it shapes the future, and that future begins in spring. It starts with planting, not the celebration of it, the weight of it. You kneel in soil, still wet with melt. You press seeds into earth that still feels unfamiliar. You pray, not loudly, not with words, but with your hands. Each movement says, please grow, please rise, please let there be enough. And the soil, it says nothing. It never did, but it opens all the same. That is the strange grace of the land. It forgets more easily than we do. It softens, it warms, it offers, and you accept, not greedily, but with the care of someone who's been without. The days stretch longer, the light brightens, but the people do not rush. They know better. They move with caution, with steadiness, because spring is a gift that must be earned again each day. The tools return to the field, not polished, not perfect, but familiar. The hoe worn smooth, the plow patched with rope, the sack tied with the same cloth used to bind a baby's feet in January. Nothing is wasted, not now, not ever again. Even the way you walk has changed. You step with more awareness. You no longer curse the mud. It means warmth. You no longer dread the sweat. It means motion. You no longer flinch at the buzz of insects. It means life. And so you move, slowly, gently, but forward. Each planted row is a vow. Each sprouting leaf is an answer. Each bite of fresh greens, bitter with the memory of snow, is a kind of blessing. The kind you don't speak out loud, because in the medieval world, blessings were fragile. So you folded them into your work. You didn't decorate the table. You swept it clean. You didn't sing while you ate. You listened to the spoon, to the chewing, to the silence of full mouths, and afterward, you sat together. No one said the words, "We made it," but you could see it in the faces, in the hands that didn't tremble, in the fire that burned not out of necessity, but habit. The community, too, began to stretch. People walked farther, visited more often, exchanged goods, shared stories. There were tales of new lambs and warm rains, of a cousin who survived the winter in the next village, of the woman who gave birth by candlelight during a blizzard, and both mother and child lived. These weren't stories of triumph, they were testimonies, proof that suffering was not the whole story, that something had survived, not in spite of winter, but because of it, because cold does not only break, it sharpens, it strips away the excess, it shows you what can't be lost, it leaves behind only what matters, and as the sun climbs higher in the sky, the people begin to see themselves again, not as victims of the season, but as witnesses to it, and they remember not just what hurt, but what held, the neighbor who offered salt, the old woman who never let the fire die, the child who told stories to keep the others from crying, the priest who gave up his bread, the stranger who knocked and was let in. You remember all of it, because these, too, are part of the winter, the parts that didn't freeze, the parts that made it through. You carry them with you now, not heavy, but woven into your every step, like threads in your coat, invisible but present. They guide your hands when you cook, they shape your prayers before bed, they steady you when the wind rises again next year, because it will rise. The frost will return, the days will shorten once more, but you will not meet it the same. You will not flinch. You will not be surprised. You will not face it alone, because now the village knows, the fire tenders, the bread stretchers, the snow watchers. They've all learned, and they will pass it on to the next cold season, to the next quiet morning, to the next child born in a snowstorm. And that, too, is survival. Not the breath, but the passing on, the memory that does not break even when the body does. So now, with the fields full, and the sun strong, and the barn stocked once more, you rest, not deeply, not yet, but with peace. And when you sit at the edge of the field, hands still dusty from planting, you close your eyes, and you don't see snow. You see a room, a fire, a bowl passed from hand to hand, a song hummed low in the dark, a life held gently through the coldest months, and you exhale because the cold is gone and you are still here, wherever you are. This is the end of the story, not a finish, not a line drawn, but a gentle settling, like the final snow of the year, light, slow, unnoticed until it's gone, because there's nothing left to survive now. The fields are full, the fire is quiet, and the hands that once trembled with cold now move with steady rhythm. You've come through it, and what's left isn't relief or triumph. It's something quieter, understanding, because after everything winter took from you and everything it left behind, you are still here. And here doesn't mean perfect, it means present, still breathing, still listening, still holding the memory of those long, gray months in the way you stir the soup, in the way you mend the roof before the rain comes, in the way you greet the wind when it returns. You no longer flinch when the cold brushes your cheek. You nod to it because it taught you more than warmth ever could. It taught you stillness, discipline, patience, but it also taught you mercy, the quiet kind, the kind that sits beside someone and says nothing, the kind that gives a second crust of bread, even when you need it yourself, the kind that builds strength without ever needing to say the word, because real strength doesn't announce itself, it waits, and now, so do you. You've learned to wait for the soil to dry, for the fire to settle, for the birds to return, for the world to soften. That's what winter gives you, in the end. Not joy, not peace, but readiness. You carry it in your breath, in your spine, in the stories you no longer need to tell out loud, because anyone who's lived through the cold knows them already. They're written into the seams of every wool cloak. They live in the silence between the last frost and the first harvest. They echo in the way someone says, "We've had worse," without needing to explain. And so, the memory of winter becomes tradition, a language only survivors speak. It's in the way the door is barred on the first snowy night, the way firewood is, stacked in even rows, the way beans are dried and hung, not out of necessity, but out of instinct. No one questions it, even the young, who've never known a true winter, learn the rhythm. They don't ask why the cellar is checked twice, why the bread is baked early, why the hens are fed by hand when the wind begins to rise. They just follow, because the body remembers what the mind forgets. And when the next winter comes, and it will, they'll be ready, not because of luck, but because of you, because you kept the fire, because you saved the last seed, because you whispered stories in the dark, because you let them sleep while you stood watch. That's the legacy of winter, not the frost on the window, not the cracked skin, not the bitter soup, but the protection of those who could not protect themselves, and the strength to do it again, if needed. So when you look back, not with fear, but with clarity, you don't see a season, you see layers of earth, of silence, of labor, of care, all woven into the shape of your life. It's there in the bread you bake, the herbs you dry, the way you teach your children to sweep the hearth with reverence, not because it's just a chore, but because it was once the line between life and death, and still is, in some places, because not all winters are cold. Some are quiet spells of loneliness, or months of uncertainty, or years of loss, and the things we learn in snow and silence we carry into every kind of dark, And what we carry, we pass on. That's how people survived, year after year, not because they were stronger, but because they remembered. And so, the story lives on, not in books, but in rooms, in kitchens, in the way someone reaches for another's hand when the cold comes back too soon. You've walked through this story with them. You've felt the silence of the frozen well. You've knelt by the last glow of a fire. You've shared the last bowl. You've waited with them for the thaw, for the sun, for the sound of birds. And now you walk forward, slowly, gently, with a piece of that season still resting in your breath. You won't need it for a while, but you'll keep it, tucked away like kindling, quiet as prayer, because some part of you always knows. The cold will come again, but next time you'll be ready. Good night.